Christopher Magezi sat quietly, listening to the droning voice of the person positioned on the other side of the table. The flat sound of corporate dribble and contention rolled outward with a practiced cadence. The words became a torrent of insulting claims that rained down upon him as he was awash in the involuntary process of the stripping away of any and all desire to continue in his chosen profession. The disrespectful nature of the opposing attorney was even nastier with vitriol enough. The robotic and unenthusiastic representation of his left-handed lawyer, who was only present because the healthcare provider paid their fee, showed little or no concern for his future as a person or a physician. This was the fourth time in the last 2 years that he had gone through this legal process relating to lawsuits connected to difficult and failed births. All of the complaining parties were blaming him of failing to recommend abortive measures in each case of a troubled pregnancy. As if this wasn't bad enough, he had recently been notified that 3 more complaints were coming down the pipe, all related to circumstances similar to this current case. He thought to himself on how he could move forward and function as a healer in a medical environment that could only have been designed by those who hated mankind. It seemed to be a never-ending cycle of compassion, concern, best medical advice, denial, and prosecution. None of it was fun anymore. That was for sure. Since his earliest training in his native Uganda, where he learned to deliver babies under the most dire circumstances, Dr. Magezi could never really understand the relationship between himself and the medical professionals in his adopted country. Being introspective, he tried to be honest in this evaluation. The driving feature and force of that adversarial position that was held by the American legal community, populated with those who seemed to work hard at protecting the pockets of their clients, and certainly their pockets, at the same time. In the mind of an altruistic doctor trying to do his best to try to pronounce just how soul-poisoning and disheartening it all was, left him speechless when he tried to explain it in a verbal manner. The irony before him was the fact that the medical establishment seemingly decided somewhere along the way to adopt a fallback position where it was standard practice to sue medical staff if a person died or injured in their care, properly blamed for the damage or not. As an obstetrician, he could never go into independent practice and financially survive as the inevitable lawsuits pursued him and left him without some form of insurance policy, a policy that was non-existent for sure. The large managed care companies were in a financial position to battle legal suits, and if he was to continue in his chosen medical field, he would be listening to the likes of people like the man before him, far into the future. As the legal word salad continued to fall on his ears, Christopher thought back as to why he wanted to be a doctor in the first place. His earliest memory was of being in the middle of a makeshift medical situation in the clapboard infirmary staffed with local women who worked under the watchful eye of the founder of the orphanage. The doctor had a very early memory of being pulled from a dark hole in the ground by a robust and rotund woman by the name of Mommy Jackie. The actual memory was fragmented and details were added as he spent time in recovery and later as a volunteer medical assistant in the orphanage dispensary. In her welcome home ministry, this laywoman missionary had a zeal for children and hers and their creator. She lifted many little ones like Christopher from cisterns and outdoor toilets as they were left to die for fear they were infected with the dreaded AIDS virus. This dark cloud of a plague that struck fear throughout the African continent, particularly near the shores of Lake Victoria in the town of Jinja. Christopher was thankful for his timely rescue by this heavy-set angel of mercy and counted every day as a blessing as he watched and later worked alongside the many volunteers that the stout woman recruited from local villages. The fact that she labored tirelessly to combat the harsh medical and living realities of the Third World in the late 1970s was never lost on the young and future doctor. To be known as a cistern baby was an honor in his small village, but when he moved to the United States, his fellow medical professionals recoiled at his story of survival. The general reaction was one of disbelief, certainly a logical reaction from someone who had never been in the crux position or exposed to just how evil they, or their fellow man, could be. The fact of the matter is, most of those lifted from the dank holes in the ground, abandoned by their misinformed loved ones, never survived. Jackie would say that those children were in God's hands, and she could only do her best as she left their fate to her God. Despite all that life had thrown at him, he had a deep reverence for the unqualified savior of his young life, and he felt that he was living on house money, a gambling term that described living days when those days were not supposed to happen at all. He heard the expression in a movie whose title escaped him, and only remembering that it sounded cool, and later discovering its true meaning, and how it applied to his life. Never knowing his parents made life slightly weird, but many of his fellow orphans were in the same strange and zombie-like world, raised by volunteers, all taking direction from the rotund missionary from the United States. He often wished for a living parent to advise him in a difficult time or situation. He was painfully aware that taking direction from someone who would abandon a baby on a fence, knowing they would be devoured by a wild animal, or dropping the infant into a stinking hole to suffocate at best, probably would not be the fountainhead of good advice or information. Despite the logical conclusions stated above, his yearning for family connection pursued him throughout his young life. He and the other children in the orphanage were very grateful that they always felt safe in their temporary home, and were grateful to be tethered to something solid, living day by day in survival mode. Mommy Jackie and her sister started with an orphanage deep in Mexico, a particular landscape of non-caring for the multitude of orphans created by the criminal gangs, drug violence, and traffickers. He was always intrigued by the woman of salvation, and was steeped in her amazing life story. Literally starting with nothing, the two women operated in faith, and she loved to tell her charges of the time when the orphanage was out of food completely, and how she had the children sit on the floor, with an empty plate, utensils at the ready, and an anticipatory empty cup, all as if they were expecting a meal was to be served at any moment. She told the children that God told her to expect a delivery of groceries, despite the fact that no one really knew where they were, or cared at all regarding their fate. As the children sat quietly in the total darkness, a truck pulled up, and a man who had recently received a financial windfall felt compelled by a higher power to deliver food to the orphanage. An act that totally bewildered the benefactor, as he had never even heard of the place prior to his divine revelation. Jackie had that kind of faith, and reasonable people mocked it as improbable, never truly understanding what they perceived to be impossible. In fact, her optimistic faith drove people in power over the edge. The children would eat, go to school, and sleep in the same hand-built facility that Jackie constructed with native volunteers after a previous and disastrous detour through Rwanda prior to arriving in Uganda. She shared a harrowing story of being harassed by a group of men who slapped her violently as she gathered 5 terrified young children to her side, as the gang demanded she give them money or the children. After being struck with the broadside surface of the large, plantation machete, the stout woman refused to give up the children or any of the funds that she did not have. The bullies tired of their game, and Jackie escaped with her young charges to a safer location. With the ethnic violence increasing around her, the stocky, gray-haired white woman stood out in this pandemic of hate and genocidal destruction, leaving her and those around her to be targeted. Her reputation of being so dedicated to faith drew many enemies, to the point that she felt that those around her were in danger because of her reputation and doings. Conflicted with the thought of leaving the vulnerable behind, she caught a flight on the first plane out, not sure even where her next destination would be. As it turned out, Jackie gained the last seat on a flight to Uganda and happened to be randomly seated next to a family relation of that country's president, and by the time she landed, she was given possession of the small compound in the hamlet of Jinja. It was here that the least likely rescuer of discarded children gave this gift of hope and clarity to this future doctor, who embraced all of it because the alternative was to accept the fallen nature of man.